to the AI podcast. I'm Paul Lay, Senior Editor at Engelsberg Ideas, and I'm joined today by Adrian Wooldridge, who is the global business columnist at Bloomberg. He worked for The Economist for many years, notably as Badget. He's a prize fellow of All Souls and the author of The Aristocracy of Talent, which was a look at meritocracy. His latest book, however, tackles liberalism. It's Centrists of the World Unite, the Lost Genius of Liberalism, and we're here to talk about that. So welcome, Adrian.
Thank you for having me.
You're here, I presume, not to bury liberalism, but to praise it. It's a defence of liberalism. You might even call it a rallying cry. But liberalism is a difficult word because it's extremely capacious, almost to the point of meaninglessness. We think of American versions of the way that word is employed. In Britain, it means something else. In Europe, perhaps something different. How do you define it? And also, in defining it, could you give us some sense of the historical process by which liberalism came to be?
Well, I'm here to praise liberalism, not to bury it. But I sometimes think we need to bury it before we praise it, that there are versions of liberalism that have become dysfunctional. And that's a big theme of this book. I would say that there are two sort of meanings of liberalism which are quite common at the moment. One is the right-wing view of liberalism, which is it essentially means the triumph of the market and the contraction of the state. That's neoliberalism. The other is the left-wing version of liberalism, which is basically that we should be kind, we should be nice to people, we should be very concerned about minorities and very concerned about people who haven't got a fair deal in life. And I think those are both possible meanings of liberalism, but they're not the essence of liberalism. You can have small government liberalism. Hayek was a liberal, but you can also have big government liberalism. Keynes was a liberal. Beyond anything else, he was a liberal. I think that being nice to people isn't really a governing philosophy. It isn't enough to make a governing philosophy. So these are possible manifestations of liberalism, not the essence of liberalism. The essence of liberalism lies really in three things. One is individualism. That is a focus on the individual as the basic building block of society and the basic thing that life is about. And I don't just mean the individual as the shopper. I mean the individual as a rational, self-fulfilling and also self-improving agent, which we may come on to talk about a bit more. Secondly, liberalism is about doubt or tolerance. It's about the notion that we don't know how people should best live their lives. Absolutely. That we don't know what is the truth of metaphysical claims about God. Absolutely. So we have to construct a regime which has room for doubt. And the third thing about liberalism is constraints on power. The notion that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely is the fundamental statement about what liberalism is about. You must have constraints rooted in constitutions, rooted in notions of individual rights on power. And these three things could be manifested in small government liberalism, big government liberalism, generous or not generous liberalism. That's a matter of circumstances and time, but these are the essence of liberalism. And I will, before going on too long, I'll just say how this came about. Through most of human history, growth was something that took place. You had 10% growth a century rather than, 10% of growth a year, as you've had in some very lucky countries. Growth was a rarity. People inherited their position in society, and their position in society was defined essentially by group obligations and group commitments rather than by their individual abilities. And that was just the nature of things because society was so moving. But also people inherited their beliefs. If they were English, they were born into if they were Western, they were born into the Catholic Church, into a certain way of looking at things. And beliefs were enforced by the authorities because it was thought that anybody who diverged from collective beliefs was a bit of a threat to society. So society was bounded by inherited positions and inherited beliefs. And what liberals did was to say, no, individuals should have a choice about what they do with their lives and should have a choice about what they believe. And that exploded traditional society. That's something that starts in the late 18th century, let's say, and gathers force in the 19th century and replaces highly traditional conservative views with a more individualistic view of the world.
It's interesting you say that when you talk about the 18th century, because in the way you explain it in the book, you do refer to Hobbes, who most people would not associate, the simplistic, vulgar version of Hobbes that we know. But in Hobbes, there is this tension, to anyone who knows his work, between order and liberty, which when you're talking about there are small state liberals, there are large state liberals, difference between a Keynes and a Hayek. What's Hobbes' role in that creation of almost what I remember Noel Malcolm talking about this in a very fine essay about liberal, illiberal, that tension there, almost as though liberalism is a balancing act.
Well, liberalism is a balancing act, absolutely. And that's why it's both so interesting and so difficult to define. Hobbes is the most liberal illiberal, or the most illiberal liberal that one can think about. But the genius of Hobbes was to say that what society consists of essentially is individuals, and what collective power should do is allow individuals to save themselves from destruction. These individuals come together, metaphorically speaking really, and form a social contract, the aim of which is to stop them from doing what they will do in a state of nature, which is to fight each other to death, to destroy each other. So it's a society based, the Hobbesian social contract is based on saving individuals from self-destruction. And the image that you have on the frontispiece of Hobbes is of a Leviathan composed of lots and lots of little individuals. And this is a view of the world which is very, very different from traditional notions of authority. Traditional notions of authority, which was to say you inherit your place in the world and have to fulfill that place. To say that society is like a big family and we're all like children unto the Father who is the King. Or the classical view of things, which is that we all have a telos. And we are naturally masters or naturally slaves. Hobbes is saying we're all equal. We're all individual, self-seeking individuals. But we come together to form a society in order to preserve our individual lives. And I think this view of the world in Hobbes leads to both the bright side and the dark side of liberalism. The bright side of liberalism meaning a society based on the preservation of individual rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But it also leads to the dark side of liberal society, which is the idea that society consists of atomized individuals who can only be controlled by a giant state, which is a view that Tocqueville, a great liberal, but a liberal who sees the dark side of liberalism, explores later on. So that's why I think that Hobbes is this crucial figure in the history of liberalism, this great illiberal liberal, although John Gray, the great sort of philosopher and critic of liberalism, says that Hobbes is the only liberal worth paying any attention to, which is a typical John Gray style thing. The other two people I talk about as the sort of the origin of liberalism are Montesquieu, who talks about how we must have a spirit of laws. He says we must have things like the division of powers, but these only make sense if you have a culture which is sort of liberal, which supports liberalism and individual rights, which I think is important. And the other person is Erasmus, who is a sort of liberal before liberalism, in that he says that liberalism, or a certain mode of life, is which he defines as liberty-producing, must be based in a sort of sentiment, that you're not too certain about things. He's a great critic of the Puritans, who are certain about a certain theology, or of the Counter-Reformation Catholics, who are also certain of certain things. And he says that liberalism is a way of life, a way of being, rooted in doubt, or rooted in tolerance, or rooted in a certain commitment to civilize, letting people do their own thing, civilized values. So liberalism is a philosophy. It's also a sentiment about how to live a good life.
I want to get onto this idea of contingency, of how contingent that history and creation of liberalism is here. I mean, we both knew Larry Siedentop, for example, who articulated this idea that's become popularized, I suppose, by Tom Holland, this idea that it's in Christianity, particularly Pauline Christianity, that you have this concept of the individual. all being equal before God. Of course, in a secular way, we could say before the law, whatever. How contingent is liberalism to the West and to that inheritance of Christianity? It's almost as though when you talk about doubt, when you talk about uncertainty, there's an element of original sin about that, and that perfection is not for this world.
Well, the question of contingency is an extremely interesting one. I think Larry Siedentop does demonstrate convincingly to me that the notion of the individual, all individuals being, as you say, equal and of equal moral worth and determining their own ends in life is something that Christianity comes up with first, and that the Western tradition embraces more wholeheartedly than any other political tradition. So if you want to see liberalism embodied in institutions and embodied in ways of life, you see it in the French Revolution or its modified development after the Revolution, or in the American Revolution, or in Britain and its parliamentary institutions. We seem to have, a certain part of the world seems to have created liberal values or liberal institutions before other parts of the world. And given the name of this podcast, I must also mention Sweden, which is the first country to use liberal, I think, one of the first countries to use liberal as a designation for a political movement, and is also the first country to pass laws concerning freedom to publish. So it's a European and Western thing. But that leads to another and very interesting question. Does it mean that the rest of the world is naturally illiberal? We should certainly realise that it's very hard to export all of the components of liberal values. That you can't just, as the Americans tried to do in Iraq, just impose democracy and expect it to flourish in the desert. You have to have, as Montesquieu said, you have to have not just the laws, but the spirit of the laws for these things to take root. But that doesn't mean that liberalism is something that's peculiar to the West, contingent to the West, and cannot flourish elsewhere. We have large chunks of the world where liberalism did flourish, has flourished. We have a parliamentary system in India. We have a parliamentary system in many, many other emerging market countries. And the question of India is particularly interesting because liberalism was, to some extent, imposed on the Indian subcontinent by imperialists who were concerned with extracting value from the local population, who wanted to impose taxes without representation and all of those terrible things. But the Indian population, significant sections of the Indian intelligentsia, didn't say this is an alien thing which we must reject. I mean, liberalism. Imperialism certainly, but not liberalism. What they said was that actually this notion of government by debate, doubt, secularism, accords with some of our own traditions, which are articulated in different ways, but have been around, government of villages by discussion and things like that. And secondly, we can take from the sort of ideas of John Stuart Mill, the ideas that we should have limited power, the ideas that we should have representation, we can take from those and use them to constrain the power of the British by asking the difficult questions. If you believe in limited power, how come the East India Company can tax us without representation? If you believe in the rights of the individuals, how come we as Indian individuals don't have these rights? And if you believe that government by argument is central, well, we're as good as arguing with anybody. We can argue. The argumentative Indian sort of comes in there. And so liberalism very rapidly produces deep roots in India. And so just as you have liberal imperialism, you have anti-imperial liberalism. And the Indian independence movement, Nehru in particular, tries to take what is best from the British tradition of liberalism, representative democracy, lots of institutions that constrain the power of the Prime Minister and the government, and a secular society, which is what you need to have in a country with so many clamouring different religions. So liberalism, contingent, yes, Larry Siedentop is right that there is a certain society that makes a breakthrough before other societies do, but not contingent to the extent of not being universifiable.
So it's rather like an industrial revolution.
Absolutely.
It begins in one place, and but it could be applied anywhere.
Absolutely. And where this argument becomes particularly interesting and intriguing is with the question of Muslim societies and Muslim assimilation.
In what sense?
Well, in the sense that there are certain people, I think, on the right, which would say that these are alien societies. They've never been liberal. They've always believed in the subordination of the individual, that this is a religion which is by its nature illiberal. I don't think that's true as an account of Muslim civilization, because there have been plenty of liberal moments, nor do I think it's true in terms of its destiny, because I think that there are liberal reformers within, even if we, of course you have Islamicism, of course you have very authoritarian voices within that religious tradition, but you also have liberal voices, you always have. And I think to say that the spirit of Islam is necessarily in conflict with the spirit of liberalism is neither justified nor helpful.
And is there an issue, though? I mean, this is one that Tom Holland, for one we've already mentioned, raises about Christianity's almost unique ability to separate church and state. And that's the criticism that's often made of Islam, not just Islam, but other religions, that there is something unique about that split when Christ says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, to God what is God's. Is that the key moment than some people claim it is?
I think it's a key moment in the history of the world, and this notion of liberal tolerance, liberal willingness to distinguish between the earthly and the eternal is a great breakthrough point. But I don't think as a practical matter it's something that can't be imitated by other religions. And you have had societies with large Muslim presences around the world which have in effect instituted a separation of church and state. India being a vast society, which once Muslim-dominated society, which have done that. And I think that if you say that Islam is inherently illiberal, you're playing two very dangerous games. One is you're sort of actually conceding to the Islamicists their version of the faith, and you're ignoring big traditions within Islam which have put constraints on the way that religion is practiced. Now, we have to be much more assertive in this country about reinforcing the separation between church and state, and in not conceding to Islamicists the idea that they can actually hold a veto over what is taught in schools, over how religion is practiced in public spaces, over their beliefs. If you're a member of this society, you have to ascribe to certain secular values. As I say, the separation of church and state, the irreducibility of the importance of religious arguments. And if you don't do that, you are committing a sin against membership of society. So when we sort of essentially, in this Batley Grammar School case, backed down and allowed a community of activists to exile a teacher who had shown, on the basis of open discussion, images of Muhammad in a classroom, having informed already the parents that this is what was going to happen and given them a right to take their children out of the classroom, that teacher has essentially been cancelled in the sense that he's disappeared. We don't know where he is, what he's done. And so a certain group of intolerant people was allowed to stop a sort of religious instruction.
And so would you be in favour of a French-style secularism? Because we do have an established church in this country. There isn't, I mean, it's simplistic to say this, but there isn't a true separation of church and state in this country.
Absolutely.
There is a classic British fudge, I suppose.
There is a classic British fudge, and I think part of being a liberal is accepting fudge, certainly in the British tradition. And I would be reluctant to go down the French road, partly because it's caused the French an enormous amount of trouble over the last century, and partly because there's a question of whether it's worth doing. Because if you listen to the average clergymen in the House of Lords, where they sit by virtue of being clergymen, it's not a particularly challenging version of faith that they're preaching.
J.C. Flannel.
J.C. Flannel, exactly so. And I would say that liberalism is based on these fundamental principles, but it's also based on, as I said, from Erasmus, a certain tolerant attitude, a willingness to allow fudge, if that fudge is not causing too much trouble.
Yeah, and that's a key point, I think.
Whether that can be preserved in a multicultural, multi-ethnic society where you're getting certain groups within the Islamic community who are incensed by this fudge, I don't know.
Your book is predicated on the idea that liberalism is in trouble. I want to try and think about how that might be reborn, renewed, but is there a point, and I'm thinking here of the 19th century, particularly John Stuart Mill, you've already mentioned in terms of Britain's relationship with India and the imperial influence there, but can we see that as a high point of liberalism and draw strength from that and apply it now?
Well, liberalism is most definitely besieged. I think liberalism globally is at its worst point since the 1930s. And I don't say that lightly because, throwing around phrases about the 1930s is a terrible thing to do. But we do have an axis of autocracy which is aggressively expanding and trying to destroy liberalism. We do have, and it worries me more every day, a man in the White House who does seem to be not only a liberal but extremely intemperate in his actions. And we have liberalism in the worst sort of possible state at the moment, which is liberalism has been the establishment for the last 40 years, and it's got all of the it's acquired all of the evils of an establishment, even to the point in some industries, such as the one in Soho, where we are now, of being sort of nepotistic, highly nepotistic. It's got all of the worst characteristics of an old regime, and it's lost its intellectual ability to renew itself and to think very deeply. So we get the sense that all of the energy is on the right or on the left, and it's become slightly inert. Now, to go back to your John Stuart Mill point, I think John Stuart Mill was a great thinker. I think he's a fascinating thinker and a brilliant writer. But he was also somebody who was brought up within a certain liberal tradition, which was Benthamite utilitarianism. He was brought up, had this extraordinary education. He was reading Greek at the age of 3. He was reading Latin at the age of 4. He wrote his first book, which was a history of India, at the age of 8. Because he was imitating his father, who was writing a 5-volume history of India.
He was an experiment, basically.
He was an experiment, a Benthamite experiment. He was like the perfect utilitarian educator. And then he has this sort of mental breakdown whereby he realizes that his life he's been over-pressured, over-processed, that he's lost any contact with his emotional nature. And later in life, he begins to read poetry, particularly the Lake poets. He begins to read people like Coleridge, who are talking about the importance of a collective national identity above and beyond atomized individuals. He also begins to look at trade unionists and think, wait a minute, the only thing that they have which puts them on a level to negotiate with bosses is collective action, is cooperating with each other. So he begins, as it were, to move a bit to the right on cultural issues, a bit to the left on economic issues. And in the process, he doesn't abandon individualism. He produces a richer and more fulfilled notion of individualism, that there is a distinction between higher preferences and lower preferences, that there are certain ways in which the individual can only get meaning from being bonded to a wider society. So he produces this version of liberalism which I think is widely echoed in the mid-19th century and is in some ways the most exciting period of liberalism. Because you get Matthew Arnold writing about culture and anarchy, you get a whole series of people talking about individualism in a way that I don't think we've talked about it as well since, saying it's something, society is about individuals, but these individuals are not Hobbesian, atomized individuals just preventing each other from killing each other. They're looking for higher purposes, they're looking for truth, they're looking for a moral life, and the function of society is to so organise itself that all of these things can be achieved. And I sort of perhaps slightly pretentious, but in my book I say that just as John Stuart Mill has this breakdown and produces as a result a fuller version of liberalism, I almost think that the last 40 years we've had a certain notion of liberalism, based upon individuals as profit-seeking, pleasure-seeking, self-maximizing individuals, a very Benthamite view on both the left and the right of individualism. And we needed to treat the Trump election and the Brexit thing as a sort of a collective nervous breakdown, like Mill's individual nervous breakdown, and think out a more fulfilling notion of liberalism. We didn't do it the first time around when Brexit happened and when the Trump first election happened, but it seems that populism is so powerful these days that unless we can rethink liberalism with a notion of producing a better individualism, then we will give in to these collectivists' threats from the left and the right.
And so would you say that modern liberals now, are naive about the nature of conflict, whether that's, I'm not talking about war there, I'm talking about political conflict within polities, and is there a naivety about that? People have described you as a muscular Whig. There is a muscularity that's been lacking, clearly.
No, absolutely. I would say that above all, liberals or the liberal establishment are corrupt and lazy. That they've done very well out of the last 40 years. If you bought a house 40 years ago, you're sitting pretty, and they have got into a certain way of thinking which has brought them rewards, and they aren't willing to question that. And so what we have had is the dominance of two strands within liberalism. One is economic liberalism, whereby essentially you praise the market, you praise business, and you not critical of the state as a repository for people who've fallen through the cracks, but you don't like the idea that the state might be judgmental about the way that people behave. Secondly, left liberalism, which, as I say, is about being nice to people, but is essentially about letting people do their own thing. It's a very permissive notion, and this
it's
sort
quite solipsistic as well.
It's solipsistic, but this is the marriage of two things: the sort of the Thatcherism of the 1980s and the 1960s cultural revolution, both of which share this idea that individuals should essentially be left to do their own thing, and society, collectivities in various ways, shouldn't pass judgment on them. And I think this idea, this version of liberalism, has reached a point where it's generating more problems than solutions. It was a period of liberation, both in terms of homosexual rights or also in terms of removing restrictions on business. But if you look at the biggest problems that are confronting us now, they are, let's say, social disorder, broken families, drug addiction, or, on the other side, internet platforms which are spreading misinformation, lack of attention, to lack of sustained attention, fragmenting our consciousness. So all of the things that we sort of have given the green light to have suddenly become a problem. And that is the point where liberals have to ask themselves hard questions about whether they've gone too far in certain directions and whether they need to moderate, move back to a sort of centre, a centre which says we need to police certain companies, internet companies in particular, but also companies that food process, companies that are selling us fatty foods and things like that in huge industrialized quantities, or gambling or things like that. In the sense that we need a richer notion of individualism. That individualism isn't just about maximizing your individual utility or seeking individual pleasure. It's about a distinction between our higher and our lower selves, which was central to Matthew Arnold and to John Stuart Mill, and we need to be rehabilitating that.
And so it's anti-utilitarian.
Very anti-utilitarian. So I think that the problem is even more deeply than just having become an establishment, there's a failure to think seriously about what makes liberalism, which is a certain notion of the individual which makes room for lower and higher selves, elevation and things like that. I'd also say in terms of the muscular liberalism, there is also the issue of autocrats and Russia and all of those things. And again, if we're looking at the balance between the individual and society, I think that there is a very strong case now for introducing national service of certain sorts because of the degree of threat from Russia. Again, Sweden is a country that's experimented with a version of this. And again, that means that moves us from individualism as doing your own thing to individualism as doing something that involves a certain degree of collective action.
This is going back to that balance.
Absolutely.
The Hobbesian balance,
Absolutely.
we might call it. There are these challenges. There have been tenets of the liberal establishment like mass migration that has never been popular. There's the challenge of new tech, which may offer opportunities, but certainly offers immense challenges, even going back to the very nature of what it is to be human. There is inequality, and I think there's particularly, this is what I see all the time, and the most profound and pressing problem in the West is the generational difference. You've talked about wealth. If you bought a house 40 years ago, very, very difficult for others now. Plus, there is the AI disruption and everything else that comes out. This is probably not going to get any better. And I was quite struck in the book by one of the heroes, one of the liberal heroes, and I really wasn't expecting that, was Teddy Roosevelt. And in the antitrust movements there. And again, this is a question of definition of what is liberalism and its changing nature and its ability to respond to different challenges.
Teddy Roosevelt was very interesting because he basically comes from the patrician upper classes. He basically inherited a position in life, a certain amount of money, and he was grew up as a sort of laissez-faire liberal. And then he begins to see two things that he defines as problematic. One is that the big industrial companies like Standard Oil and Carnegie Steel are becoming so big that they're overmastering the political system. They're dominating the political system. There is a sense in which they have become power without responsibility. And the second thing that he does is to see that you're getting a hereditary aristocracy, that certain people who are born to money are inheriting fortunes so vast that they'll never dissolve. They'll pass their privileges down to their children and their grandchildren, and that in doing so, they're not only corrupting the American ideal, which is an ideal of everybody having an opportunity.
This is meritocracy.
But they're also corrupting themselves. They're becoming a decadent elite. And he is a sort of very muscular figure, Teddy Roosevelt, and he thinks that this elite of effete people is terrible. And, everybody should be getting up and having cold showers and going running. They shouldn't be decadent millionaires or billionaires. And I think both those things are not only true today, but in some ways even truer than they were in Roosevelt's time, because we do have giant companies which are as big as Rockefeller's and Carnegie's creations. And I think we do need more militant use of antitrust legislation to break them up or to reduce their power. But they're also selling us things which are inherently corrupting. That what Facebook and Meta, as it's called, and various other tech platforms are selling is a fragmentation of our attention span, is addiction to short-term stimuli, and they're also opening the way for the dissemination throughout our culture of hardcore pornography, making it easier to gamble, making it easier to sort of live a solipsistic life, which is just done in front of our screens. And I think they're a sort of poison to society. And I saw Mark Andreessen recently talking about how the individual is a relatively recent sort of Western creation, and a lot of these people, I think, are anti-individualistic. In they see the individual as almost as a constraint on perfect commerce. Perfect commerce would turn in all individuals into identikit sort of people pressing the pleasure button. To how the individual is the core of a liberal philosophy. And in order for an individual to become a rational entity, he or she needs to have a capacity for attention, access to true and undistorted news, and ability to, and a notion of self-improvement. So if you think of your days going to university, the ideal tutor is somebody who says to you, you will improve yourself if, in order to understand this bit of history, you've got to produce a nice essay here, but you need to read this person or read that person or go off in that direction or go off in another direction. They're constantly looking at what you've done and giving you ways to make yourself a better historian or a better thinker or a better humanist. Does AI do that? I don't think instinctively AI does the opposite of that. It reinforces it serves you up stuff that's easy and it reinforces where you already are. It's the opposite of a good tutor. So I think that aspect of the internet is extremely worrying. And I think the sort of fortunes you are now seeing in the United States with the erosion of inheritance tax, the creation of all sorts of mechanisms whereby you can get round inheritance tax, point to a future where society ceases to be meritocratic and becomes a hereditary aristocracy. I'm not saying that the hereditary wealth is the biggest problem here. I think the biggest problem is the destruction of education, which is aspirational, which tries to find the best talent and give it all the resources it needs to improve. But you have this peculiar sort of, again, combination of the conservative right, which is just concerned with preserving its own wealth, and the identitarian left, which says, well, everybody should be equal and nobody should be treated differently and there's no difference in natural talents.
And what's the relationship between this has become almost a cliche, this concern about literacy, about reading and attention spans. How important is that to liberalism? And how important is that to democracy? And how important is democracy to liberalism? Because we've had liberalism without democracy, or at least a democracy that we'd recognise in the 21st century. What's the relationship? Because there are tensions there.
I think liberalism is based upon reading cultures. The rise of liberalism, is almost coincidental with the rise of literacy or of highly literate communities.
Well, it began with Erasmus.
It begins with Erasmus, whose job is to translate the Bible and to disseminate his translations of the Bible, and cares deeply, deeply, deeply about the meaning of words. Some of the greatest liberal figures are, let's say, John Stuart Mill, or John Milton coming out during the English Revolution with fantastic statements about the importance of freedom of debate and writing these down in some of the greatest language produced. Again,
I'd never thought of Milton as a liberal before.
Milton isn't a liberal, but he does defend freedom of debate in a way that's extraordinarily memorable. So liberalism is bound up with the rise of a literate culture and is bound up with the rise of defence of freedom of speech. And again, in the United States, you have that enacted in the Constitution. And the great sort of defenders of liberalism have been highly verbal, highly articulate people. So, and Montesquieu says that it's not enough to have paper constitutions if those paper constitutions are disconnected by a spirit of law. And I think that spirit of constitutional law is rooted in society, and it's rooted in societal literacy. So I think this whole move that we're having, and it's quite clear that if you get your information mainly from Twitter, your attention span is being diluted or fragmented, and you're being constantly subjected to emotional stimuli. And it's quite clear that if you read on the iPad or on the computer screen, you're not retaining as much of that information as you are when you read books. I think the evidence of that is overwhelming. I also think the Montesquieu thing comes with the issue of democracy. I think liberalism and democracy are not identical things, and I think the Bush administration made a vast mistake in talking endlessly about spreading democracy to the Middle East before and disconnecting it from liberal culture, liberal institutions, constraints on power. And if you have premature democracy, what you will tend to get is the majority bullying the minority, or a system of clientelism developing, whereby the state is used as a way that certain pressure groups can get things out of things. So the fundamental liberal principle is constraints on power, treating power as something that's suspect and needs to be constrained, rather than just one man, one vote, although one man, one vote, or one woman, one vote is very important in it. So one of the first countries in Europe to embrace, to have a democratic system, to have universal franchise for men, is Greece. And Greece uses that not to create a successful modern country, but basically to treat the state as a source of gifts. So too much democracy is, or democracy unmoderated by a liberal culture and liberal institutional constraints on power, is a dangerous thing.
A hyper-democracy.
A hyper-democracy, yeah.
Because one of my big fears looking ahead is thinking of H.G. Wells' Time Machine and the Eloi and the Morlocks, where you have this small, highly educated, but essentially effete and decadent ruling class. And then you have this ignorant, purposefully ignorant underclass. And that society benefits neither.
Yep.
They're both going on very different paths, but both paths that lead to destruction of the two. How on earth do we save ourselves from that fate?
Well, it's partly through economic redistribution. I think that's, there is a case for that, particularly given that a certain section of society of a certain age has accumulated so many assets, which are worth so much, and so many younger people are excluded from that asset class. I think that redistribution case is certainly something which we need to think about very seriously. And what I've tried to say, what I've tried to say in this book is we must have a revival of the centre. And one of the things that's wrong with the centre is it's identified with a whole bunch of people who are too old and too rich, essentially. We need a radicalism that comes from younger people. We don't want all the younger people going to the Green Party or to Reform. We want younger people staying in the centre but saying, well, you've actually corrupted our ideal. But I also think, talking about the Morlocks and the Eloi, that we need to constrain the power of tech companies, which are multiplying the Morlocks. But I also make a case in this book that liberalism has flourished best when you have had almost self-conscious elites which have seen their role as being making society work better. And this was the elites of the mid-19th century who were selected by open competition and spent their lives trying to get rid of what was then called old corruption in order to produce a better state. These were the elites of the late 19th, early 20th century who said that actually society is falling apart because it's too unequal. And so they went out into poorer parts of London and created workers' education programs and things like that. So they saw themselves and were enlightened elites, and they thought that one of the things they needed to do was to address the problem of education, of spreading culture, high culture, to poorer people. And what you saw was those poorer people absolutely clamouring for high culture, absolutely clamouring for it. They didn't think that this was effete nonsense opera and that sort of thing which is irrelevant to them. They wanted to have that high culture. And I think that we need to have an educated elite in this country, which is more willing not just to preach higher values, but to disseminate higher culture values, not out of a sense of superiority, but out of a sense that there is an unmet demand out there for these things. These values are good values, but they're also values that everybody, they're goods that everybody ought to have access to. And I went recently to the BBC, and I found that an inordinately depressing experience, because this is our national broadcaster. This could be a way of communicating intellectually challenging, culturally stimulating, aesthetically valuable things to the world. There was not a single thing that I saw in that institution as I walked through it that proclaimed the word wreath or sweetness and light. All I saw was huge advertisements for Call the Midwife. Everywhere Call the Midwife, as though their highest calling was to produce popular stuff that ITV is also producing, and that's their merit. There is no such, and I think that if you look at the explosion of podcasts like this one, if you look at the the appetite for popular history, if you look at the appetite for really good history books that you can see, they are misunderstanding not just their role, which they are clearly misunderstanding, but also the amount of appetite there is in the public for all of that.
And the failure of the BBC is mirrored in the Academy.
Absolutely. And that is a lack of self-confidence.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, in the academy, it's worse than lack of self-confidence, because quite a lot of it in the academy is because you have fashionable views which say that we must trash Western civilization or notions of individual identity, because that was what a group of fashionable, in my view, deeply misguided French people did in the 1960s.
And that seems to imply, from what you say, that the best agent of that re-liberalism, if we might call it that, is the nation state.
I think that one of the things that liberals have done is to reject the importance of the nation state and to over-embrace globalization, partly because they fail to see the damage that hyper-globalization, particularly giving access to Chinese goods made by forced labour, would do to working class communities, manufacturing industries in the West, but also because they failed to see the nation state as an agent of the transmission of cultural values, cultural identities, of our collective higher selves.
I was trying to make a list of countries that embody the best of liberalism. We've mentioned Sweden, I think a great liberal state, Norway, the Netherlands perhaps, Canada, we might say the UK, more difficult case to argue now, but it's a case. They're all constitutional monarchies, all the ones that I wrote down and saying, well, these are potential candidates for this, or many of them were constitutional monarchies, and I wondered if there was anything revealed by that.
Yeah, I think that certainly the constitutional monarchies were the first countries to try to dilute power through constitutional mechanisms. That's what they are. And if you look back at the English Revolution or the Dutch Revolution, they're all ways in which the issue of who has power is thought about seriously, and the conclusion that is reached is that power is in itself a problem. So you don't just move from king despot to king demos. You put constraints on power, and I think that indicates a certain seriousness which has manifested itself in the survival of liberal cultures. I think you could add Switzerland to your list, which is a very intricate constitutional regime, and is exceptionally successful at preserving certain core liberal values. I think the thing that most worries me about the current era is what's happened to the United States, partly because it's very big and very powerful, partly because it is the home of the new technologies which have global implications, and partly because there's never been a period in which the United States disengaging itself from a global liberal regime has led to anything other than disaster. In the 19th and early 20th century, the global liberal order, free trade, and a certain order in the seas was preserved by the British, and they kept doing it with extraordinary cunning and extraordinary success in many ways, until they couldn't do it any longer because they just didn't have the economic power to do it. And then you had this period in the 1920s and the 1930s where we had global anarchy unleashed and eventually the rise of fascism in various forms. So all these people who said imperialism is the worst possible thing, or British imperialism is the worst possible thing. Well, wait a minute, there is something worse, and that is anarchy, no global hegemon, and countries struggling for dominance, leading to absolute disorder. And this seems to be what's happening again. America has withdrawn from the role of hegemon, but it's withdrawn from the role of hegemon not because it lacks the economic might in the way that Britain did in the 1920s. America is 25% of global GDP now. It was 25% of global GDP in the 1990s, in the supposedly unipolar moment. It's done it because of domestic political travails. And those domestic political travails are driven by extreme polarization, and that extreme polarization, which is as bad on the left as on the right, in the sense of embracing aggressive minority causes which don't command attention, has led to the rise of an illiberal strongman as leader of the United States, and that is an extremely dangerous place to be.
Well, Adrian, we end on a less than optimistic note, but I think there's plenty in your book that is there to offer solace and optimism, and Centrists of the World Unite, The Lost Genius of Liberalism, is published by Alamy. It's available now. Adrian Wooldridge, thank you very much.
Thank you.